Hello, my name is Grace Lewis, and I am a principal researcher at the Software Engineering Institute. Today I'm going to talk about our FY21 Lens project titled Predicting Inference Degradation in Production Machine Learning Systems. The motivation for this work is that the quality of the inference of machine learning models after they are deployed changes over time, mainly due to the differences between the characteristics of the data that the model was trained with and the data that that model is encountering in production. The state of the practice in industry to deal with inference degradation is to do periodic retraining and model redeployment. So in a way, what they're doing is evading inference degradation as opposed to monitoring for it. However, this strategy of periodic retraining and redeployment becomes more infeasible as DoD AI systems move into the operational AI space, which is characterized by scarce resources, fast tempo, and significant implications of failure. The problem with inference degradation, it's that it's really difficult to detect in a timely and reliable manner. If you look at the diagram on the left, if you do it too frequently, if you retrain before the model has reached its threshold for inference quality, what you're doing is you're wasting resources training and deploying that retrained model when it was not really necessary to do so, in addition to normal redeployment risks. If you do it too late, then what happens is that you're basically operating with a model that is not really operating at optimal conditions. And so, for example, if you're using a machine learning model to do object detection, there could be some objects that you miss because you retrained too late. In addition to that, as shown in the diagram on the right, not all degradation is gradual. Sometimes it's just sudden. Imagine a situation where, again, you're doing object recognition and some kind of disaster happens. In that case, you really have to redeploy quickly because you're going to be operating in non-optimal conditions for a really, really long time. So basically, the failure to recognize inference degradation in a timely manner can really lead to misinformed decisions, costly reengineering, and potential system decommission for DoD systems because basically the users stop using it because they don't trust it. So as a solution to this problem, this project basically has two goals. The first goal is to develop a set of empirically validated metrics that can predict when a model's inference quality is going to degrade due to different types of data drift and therefore requires retraining. The second is to develop a test harness to help model developers really understand how their models are behaving due to drift and then select appropriate metrics and thresholds for monitoring. So the advantage of doing this is that the developed metrics and their thresholds can be integrated into MLOps pipelines or any type of ML model monitoring infrastructure to basically determine two things. When a model really needs to be retrained, and second, what are those thresholds that you need to be looking for that minimize the time that that model is not operating adequately? So in order to do this, we set up a series of experiments. The first thing we did is that we selected the SAR dataset as the dataset for experimentation, which we classified as a DoD relevant dataset because it's pretty close to the image classification datasets and data types that are used by DoD ISR applications. This is a data set from a Kaggle competition where the goal of that competition was to basically identify icebergs in satellite images. The second thing is that based on this SAR data set, we identified relevant drift types that we could introduce into this data set for experimentation. The drift had to be of sufficient magnitude to be detected, but it also had to be realistic. And this proved to be one of the most challenging parts of the project because there is not a lot of work out there in introducing realistic drift into data sets. And then, as a third part of the experiment, we now had to identify candidate metrics that would be able to identify each type of introduced drift. And for doing this, we performed quite an extensive literature review of drift detection methods to understand the state of the research and practice and be able to identify metrics that would be applicable to the type of drift that we introduced in the data sets. So as far as experiment set and metrics, we created a set of actually total of 16 experiments where what we did was, based on the SAR data set, we identified real scenarios that would indicate that drift is occurring. So for example, if the number of icebergs declines with seasons, this would be an example of gradual drift. If there is a reoccurring decrease in icebergs over multiple seasons, this would be an example of reoccurring gradual drift, and so forth. So what we did is we identified 16 experiments based on these scenarios and these drift types, and by using different rates of drift, we were able to come up with 16 separate and explicit experiments. As far as metrics, we decided to work with basically 6 metrics. 4 distance metrics, and 2 error metrics. So the distance metrics are important because basically what they do is that they measure the difference between 2 probability density functions. And error metrics, basically what they do is they compute a statistic that has a well-defined distribution that corresponds to the null hypothesis. And by having 2 types of metrics, we're basically looking at drift from 2 different perspectives or assumptions. Our test harness that was developed as part of this project is composed of 3 tools. The first tool is the trainer. And that trainer, it takes in a base data set, it takes in the configuration file, the model portion, and it trains a CNN-based model with a given set of parameters based on TensorFlow. The second tool, which is the drifter, it takes as input the base data set, and it takes also as input the same experiment configuration file, but the drift section. And then basically what it does is it generates a drifted data set from this base data set and based on the drift that we're asked to introduce into the base data set. And then the third tool, which is probably the most important piece of the project, is the predictor tool. The predictor tool takes as input the base data set, the drifted data set, and the trained model. And in addition, the same configuration file, but there is a metrics section. And then what it does is that it runs the trained model with the drifted data set and produces 2 things. It produces prediction results. What were the prediction results based on that drift data set? And also, what were the values of the prediction metrics when we did this over time? The tool supports 2 different workflows, which we believe is very important for engineering these types of systems. First of all, it supports a model development workflow as follows. The trainer component, you can use it to train the model, or you can use whatever framework or tools you're comfortable with, but the first part is to train the model. Then what you do as a model developer is you define drift induction functions for those type of drift that you believe are relevant to the scenarios that your model is going to encounter in production. You run the drifter to produce the drifted data sets. Then you would run the predictor to obtain measures for the defined drift metrics, and you basically would iterate over and over, doing some analysis until you can say, well, 2 things. Here is a trained model, but in addition to that, here are the drift metrics that I would like to have monitored in production along with their thresholds to be able to detect at runtime in production when the model is drifting. As far as the model integration, deployment, and operations workflow, basically that workflow, it starts with the trained model and that same set of drift metrics and thresholds. And in this workflow, you would wrap the model into a machine learning component if needed. You would set up model monitoring using the same predictor tool from the first workflow as part of your infrastructure to monitor specifically for those drift metrics and thresholds. Then you would deploy the model, and then what happens over time, the predictor would be running, at some point, the predictor and its infrastructure would notify the system that drift is happening. And at that point, based on how the system was configured, it could either generate an alert that says, oh, the model is drifting, something has to be done, or maybe we have some type of automation in place where basically what it does is it retriggers some automated model retraining or model replacement process. Or in maybe a more sophisticated scenario, you could take the data that is being produced by the predictor tool and do some additional data analysis, like for example, to detect false positives or something along those lines. One thing that we set out from the start, from this test harness, is that we wanted it to be extensible and flexible because we want to make it available to the open source community, to developers, to practitioners, so that they can study drift in their models. So the architecture of the test harness includes very explicit and very well documented extension points. So you can introduce new data sets, new drift induction functions, and also drift detection metrics. And in addition to that, as I highlighted in the previous slide, experiments are defined via configuration files, and to support different types of drift analysis. Like for example, you could use it, as in the previous workflow, for defining what are relevant drift metrics and thresholds for monitoring. You could also use it in a more experimental way, just to see how the model behaves when introducing new different data types, different drift types. And also, you could also use it to decide, like, what is the threshold at which you think it's necessary to incur the cost of gathering new labeled data for retraining. So the test harness supports different extension points. It supports multiple configurations and also different types of analyses. So let's talk about how we decided to do drift induction in our system. Well, there are 2 options for modeling drift behavior. The first one would be to apply drift to the feature space and observe the drift independent of time. An example of this for object recognition would be to alter the actual images using, for example, blurring techniques or changing contrast or changing color. That would be applying drift to the feature space. Another way to introduce drift is to apply it to the drift, apply the drift to base rates and observe the drift by time series. An example of this would be to change the distribution of the input data and see how the model behaves with this change. What we decided to do is we selected the second option for several reasons. First of all, it was more compatible with the scenarios that we wanted to evaluate in the SAR dataset. And second, because we decided that it would be more applicable not only to different types of data, but also different types of models beyond CNN models. So what is the process that we followed for drift induction? So basically what we do is that in our samples, which is the drifted dataset, we sort the samples into configured bins by their classification. So on the left is an example of what the configuration file would look like for the drift portion. So in our case, in the SAR dataset for iceberg detection, you have two classes. You have images with no icebergs, which we call 0, and images with icebergs, which we call 1, and these are our two bins. After that, you would define how many time boxes do you want to analyze the data in. And so in this particular case, going back to the diagram on the left, what we have decided is that the data set has 9,999 samples, and basically what we said is we want 3 time boxes of the same size, which is the 3,333. And when you run the process, basically what it does is, based on the percentages by time box, it extracts samples from each one of these bins and creates the time box. So going back to the example on the right, this is a condition for this, or the example here is sudden drift. And basically what we're saying is when you do the drift induction, for our 3 time boxes, we want the first time box to include 65% of icebergs, which is 1. We want the second time box to include 40% icebergs. And we want the last time box to include 60%. So that going from 65 to 40 would be an example of sudden drift. And that is how we induce drift into the data sets. The tool itself, basically then what it does is the user, the model developer, would call the drifter with a base data set and the experiment configuration details, which, as I showed before, include the drift type to introduce. The drift algorithm, which in previous case was sudden, is matched to the actual code that applies sudden drift. And finally, the data set with drift is created, and it's linked to the base data set, and it's ready to use by the predictor tool. So once again, the extension points basically allow us to not have to change anything in the code if you want to create new drift functions. What you would do is actually create a new drift function and link it to the tool. The predictor, what it does based on this information is now that it has a drifted data set, basically, first of all, it runs the trained model with the drifted data set and saves all the predictions into a prediction file. And then for each configured metric, it calculates that metric per each time box and saves it in a metric file. And once again, the extension point here, as is shown on the right, basically says, look, for the metrics that we want to run for this particular experiment are 2 metrics. We want to run KL divergence, and here are the parameters to do that. And we want to run the KS statistic. And once again, this is done in configuration files outside of the code, which allows for extensibility. So what were the results from our initial experiment run? So once we had the test harness ready, once we had the data set, we had the drift induction scenarios, everything ready, we did our first end-to-end run with the test harness. However, unfortunately, the results were not what we expected. Basically, what happened was that the model that we selected was not sensitive to the way that we induced drift. What we did is that we selected one of the models from the same Kaggle competition, and basically it's an object classification model. And so what we realized is that the type of drift that we were introducing is really more relevant to a time series models of counts of icebergs rather than a classification model to identify if an image contains an iceberg. So as you can see on the right, there is barely any difference between the baseline, which is the data set with no drift, and our most aggressive drift scenario. You can barely tell the difference between those two. So what happens is we had to repeat our experiments. And so basically the next step for us is to build a time series model that is fit to the aggregated output of the original classifier. However, because it does take time to set up the experiments, to create the new trainer, to to change the configuration file to the types of drift and things we want to introduce, we wanted to make sure that our hypothesis that we would be able to observe drift was correct. So what we did is that we generated a simulated data set, and we added drift into this data set, and we selected a subset of the metrics, and we said, okay, would this work if we did that with the SAR data set? And the nice thing is that it does really work. The results with our simulated data experiments show that different metrics are able to capture different types of drift at different points in time. So looking on the right, this is the value of the metrics of four metrics that we selected for evaluation. The baseline is the green. The orange is an example of gradual drift. The blue-purple is an example of recurring drift, and then the pink is an example of sudden drift. As you can see from the Hellinger distance metric, that metric doesn't detect the sudden drift at all. You can see that the pink is overlaid with the green. On the other hand, all the other ones are pretty good at detecting sudden drift, some better than others. And in some cases, like for example, for the TS statistic, it recognizes sudden drift very, very quickly. In addition to that, you can see that at least for KL divergence, KA statistic, and the T statistic, you're able to detect the different types of drift almost within 10 new samples. So the data from our simulated data experiments is showing promise. And so really the next steps for us are to repeat the set of experiments applying drift and creating the time series model and doing it with the SAR data set. So what are the project contributions? First of all, the easy-to-use, extensible, and flexible test harness software. Like I said before, it supports model development and the model deployment workflows. What it does, which is the great advantage, it provides input to MLOps pipelines to figure out what drift metrics to detect and monitor in production, as well as their thresholds. And also, the extensibility really supports new data sets, drift induction functions, and drift detection metrics via extension points that do not require modifying the code of the test harness, but rather writing new algorithms for these functions and metrics if necessary. The second contribution is a set of validated metrics for detecting different types of drift. Once we finish running the experiments, we will have that set of validated metrics. The way we introduce drift induction functions, those are also going to be shared as part of this project, and they can be applied to other data sets, not just the SAR data set. And in addition, the summary of the state-of-the-art drift detection methods that we had to do as part of identifying metrics. So the next steps for us, first of all, to conduct additional experiments with this new time series model. Second, we're going to document and publish results in both a software engineering and a machine learning venue, because that way we get to both types of audiences. And third of all, we're going to release the test harness as open source by the end of December 2021. And by doing this, what we're looking for is to collect feedback from all of you. We want to collect feedback on DoD relevant scenarios, on drift types that you're seeing in production, and also applications of how you would be using this tool as part of your model development and deployment and operations process. This is the team, and with that, I am very happy to take questions. Thank you.